One thing I love about Hinduism is its refusal to be put in a box.
If you look at just the general population of Hindus growing up in Canada, everyone simply wants to live their life. They want to preserve whatever traditions they know.
The CNN finally wrote about the hate that's been targeting Hindus. If we are willing to accept hate against Diwali, then where are we really drawing the line as Hindus?
India is generally 80% Hindus. When you are saying anti-Indian hate is not anti-Hindu hate, you are basically whitewashing everything, and you don't want to actually pinpoint what the problem is. And if we don't address the root problem, this is never going to stop.
Sometimes compromise is not possible with somebody who really just feels you have no right to exist. But if somebody just says, don't do Murti Puja or don't do something, well, I'm sorry, I'm not asking you to do Murti Puja, but if it's important to me, I will do it. And if I'm going to build a temple on private land with my money, if that bothers you, that's on you, not on me.
You can start trying to frame yourself as being a good Hindu, or you can look at it in a different way, saying that these are our traditions. I'm going to explain it to you in a way that you understand.
Are we going to be painted as fascists, as Hindu nationalists? And at the same time, if we are painted as that, why would they want to work with us? Whenever I talk about Hindu advocacy, I always said that we are a Hindu-American group. We are not an Indian group.
So how do we empower Hindus to make sure that any baggage associated with labels does not bleed over into other more fundamental aspects of Hinduism?
You have to just look at it. What is it that I want to preserve? Am I concerned enough to ensure that Hinduism survives for the next generation?
Georgia actually recognized Hinduphobia at the state level. The first point of tackling this problem is to give it a name. Unless it has a name, nobody's going to talk about it.
And a lot of Hindu students frankly don't have any opinions on these political issues. In fact, it's a prerequisite to being the vocal and public Hindu on your campus.
Hindus must know their rights and report the hate crimes to police and administrators. Do not stay silent. Namaste, everybody. We're starting right on the dot today. So thank you for everyone who has already joined. I love it when the Hindu Desi community is there, belying our reputation. So my name is Pushpita Prasad. I am on the board of the Coalition of Hindus of North America, CoHNA for short. CoHNA is a nonprofit advocacy organization with a focus on really driving grassroots actions for Hindus in all walks of our life in across North America. Basically the United States and Canada. We actually celebrating our 5 years this year, and it's been quite a journey. And I think some of those issues will come up in our conversation today. I'm also very excited to have two fabulous, articulate panelists with me, co-warriors on this path of Dharma in action. So I'll take a minute to ask them to introduce themselves, and then we'll come to the topic at hand. So Shawn, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Namaste, everyone. My name is Shawn. For those that follow me on social media, I do run a platform called Hindu Lifestyle. I started making YouTube videos in 2017 for about 2 years, and I stopped for 5 years when I had kids, and then I came back to it in 2023. My focus is a lot on telling the story of someone that's been twice removed from India, growing up Hindu in Canada, where my own parents are not from India as well. They came from the Caribbean. And what does it mean to be Hindu growing up now? And now that I have kids of my own, moving forward, who speaks for us, what our opinions are, what our voices are, and just trying to counter the narratives that exist, but not only focus on that, but also come up with a positive vision of what does it mean to be Hindu today. So for everyone that's here, I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you.
Hail, namaste. My name is Aryan. I'm part of the CoHNA Youth Action Network, so CYAN Berkeley chapter at UC Berkeley. So a lot of the work we do, you might have seen on social media, such as sponsoring Hindu Heritage Month at UC Berkeley. And then more recently, we had a Kafiristan event webinar, which talked about the indigeneity and history of the Hindu population in Afghanistan. A lot of the work we do at Berkeley is centered specifically on advocacy, organizing, and ensuring that Hindu students are represented on campus, as well as our views are represented on campus. And of course, our goals are to kind of replicate that across the United States and broader North America.
Wonderful. And I think the reason we have Shawn and Aryan on today is one of the main reasons why CoHNA exists is we are all about framing our identity and fighting for our rights in our homes here in the United States and Canada. And that brings me to the topic of today's discussion, which we titled as Hindutva, Hinduphobia, and Hinduism, because we live in an era where labels are predominant. Everyone is looking for the shorthand of a label to kind of put you in a box. But I think the one thing I love about Hinduism is its refusal to be put in a box. For centuries now, people have been trying to box the faith, define it in this way or that way. And as a Hindu advocate myself, I always say one of the only things I say definitively about Hinduism is its diversity and its flexibility to so many different viewpoints in so many ways. So these labels that have become very prominent as a way of framing us, labeling us, dividing us, and frankly, silencing us is something where we thought we wanted to talk about, because a lot of CoHNA's fight and reason for existence over the past 5 years has been how Hindus are sought to be put into boxes and given neat categories as a good Hindu, a bad Hindu, an okay Hindu, based on the label that is assigned to them. So I do have a video I wanted to show, but before I did that, I wanted to just get the take from Aryan and Shawn on what these labels mean to you and how do you look at them?
Yeah, it's a pretty big question. So, when you talk about the label as a Hindu, it's something that I think many of us have grappled with, more so when you start thinking about it in the context of growing up in Canada, because Hindu, by identifying as a Hindu, it gives you the rights and the protections as a formalized religion. So in that context, yes, that's very much needed. When you start to get deeper, though, you start realizing that the term Hindus probably doesn't do justice to actually the breadth and the depth that it does start to encompass. When you get to the other labels, Hindutva, then you start realizing, and what I've found is that the using of these terms, especially in a North American context, whether it be America or Canada, has come to, for me anyways, is being used to sort of silence any positive identity with trying to just simply preserve your roots. And it's something that I've grappled with when I started making videos online. And when I came back to it again, what I found just coming up over and over again is that any positive expression of being Hindu is met with the same criticisms over and over. And at first I thought it was something that was coming from the far left, where they're focused on social justice and trying to sort of say that any Hindu practice is going against the principles of social justice. But recently now, where we're seeing it also now from the far right, is that these labels are now being used to sort of silence any identification with even wanting to be Hindu. I did a video about this not too long ago, and I was just surprised to just read what came out of this report, that you enroll your kids, and I have kids now, they're 7 and 4, and I teach in our Bal Vikas program as well, but you enroll your kids in this, and all of a sudden you're a Hindu nationalist, you're a Hindu fascist. You donate to the mandir, you're labeled the same thing. And any positive expression is just met with this, and it then makes you then wonder, well, what's going to happen if you go down this path 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And at some point, we need to confront it and label it for what it is that these are just labels that are being used to silence the Hindu voice. If you look at just the general population of Hindus growing up in Canada, everyone simply wants to live their life. They want to preserve whatever traditions they know of what their families have participated in. They're not concerned with all of these labels. But what ends up happening, though, is that in the media and what we start seeing in news reports and even out of academia is that it will slowly have the trickle down effect of where it starts to silence these voices to the point where I think many people might just not want to associate it with it anymore. Now, that's my very long-winded answer, and we can get into a lot of the details of it, but I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is I think on college campuses, when you kind of see like the 80% of like cultural quote unquote Hindus, I think a lot of them don't want to have to do with anything like Hindutva, and I would go to the extent of saying Hinduphobia. And so when they see a lot of these instances happening on college campuses, whether that's of course Hindu Heritage Month, but also just acts of Hinduphobia, whether that be from the far left or far right, it ends up making them want to dissociate themselves from either of these political movements. And so, like, for example, I think a lot of the commentary, especially within like our bubbles of like Hindu advocacy space, center a lot around like being pro-Hindutva, being anti-Hindutva. Like even when we're advertising for this event, right, you'll see comments on the post saying, "Hey, please preserve Hindutva," or another comment will say, "Hey, let's not talk about Hindutva." That's a reality of X and Twitter. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think the fundamental gap between, I would argue, the older generations and the second generation is that second generation isn't grappling with a battle to fight in support or against Hindutva. They're battling in a fight to not be obligated to even answer those questions in the first place. So it's a higher level conversation that's being had on the second generation level where, for example, in order to host an Hindu event on campus, you shouldn't have to proudly proclaim before you host it that I'm not a Hindu nationalist, because the moment you have to do that, now you're taking a political stance. And a lot of Hindu students, frankly, don't have any opinions on these political issues, especially, by the way, if you're not an Indian Hindu, right? You could be a Hindu from the Caribbean and you might not necessarily have like any care for the term like Hindu nationalism, but all of a sudden you're obligated. In fact, it's a prerequisite to being a vocal and public Hindu on your campus. So I think the conversations that need to be had are at a higher level, and it's less about, people will get mad at me sometimes when I say this. They're always telling me, "Why aren't you a proud Hindu nationalist? Why don't you support Hindu nationalism?" And I tell them, it has nothing to do with supporting Hindu nationalism. Rather, it has more to do with an obligation to say something that I'm not or that I am in order to host a Hindu event and just be culturally Hindu. So I think the battle is much higher level than what people think it is.
It's pretty shocking to know that you have to fill out a form like that to be able to, host a Ganesh Puja or a yoga event or whatever. I think it shows how dangerous these labels can get because, that's pretty weird to know. And if you look at the words, Hindutva just means the essence of Hinduism, and that's not Hindu nationalist groups. That's basically, that came from the Indian Supreme Court. And again, not to get into defining terms or labeling, but I think it's about the right of every Hindu to exist and to choose how they want to, live and practice their Hinduism without, like you said, having to fill out boxes and check boxes. But since you talked about campus, I thought we would kind of close out this question by looking at how some academics from a number of universities talked about this very issue of Hindutva versus Hinduism. It is a question that haunts us a lot. So Jaibai, I don't know if it's possible to show that video because, and obviously you are on campus, Aryan, or many of us have kids who are on campus or will be on campus. So what professors and academics are saying does have so we'll just stop and watch this video for a minute.
Are the panelists saying that the caste system is inseparable from Hinduism? And if that is the case, then why not dismantle Hinduism and not just Hindutva?
Hindutva project is not merely the control of the BJP. Hindutva project is to actually spread the tentacles of Hinduism in every society.
These guys are corporate malignant Brahmins, as I call it. Sundar Iyer and Ramana Kompella. These last names, Iyers, Kompella, Trivedi, Sharmas, Mukherjees, and so on. They seem to be violent advocates of this kind of malignant Brahminism, which we need to talk about. So my question is, have we ever dealt with Brahminism and the connection between Brahminism and Nazism in a lot more theoretical way? I also want to propose probably Brahminism played a very crucial role in the evolution of Nazism.
I take Hindutva as political Hinduism, not a distortion of some inherently benign religion, but a historical expression of it, with continuities in the works of Dayanand Saraswati, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, and Savarkar. Even Gandhi.
Whatever may Hindus say, actually, it does not make a difference that Hinduism is a danger to independence, equality, and thus it is the enemy of democracy. The idea that Hinduism per se is harmless and only Hindutva is the culprit will not do any good to the observance of the lofty ideals, democratic ideals.
Without hesitation that Hindutva is indeed inseparable from Hinduism, and arguments of Hindutva is not Hinduism are deeply dangerous, Brahmanical, and laced with irritation and violence.
When Durga Puja trends, hashtag Durga Puja, to trend hashtag Mahishasura caste oppression.
Hindutva is in fact Hinduism. We believe strongly that we must begin not by denying the Hinduness of Hindutva.
I did not at least hear anyone, definitely myself, deny the fact that Hinduism is deeply imbricated with Hindutva. Nobody on this panel denied.
So for those of you that may remember, this was the infamous Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference that was held in September 2021 on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So as the United States mourned the largest terrorist attack that had ever struck the country, 50 plus universities from across the globe, really, because a lot of Indian universities were involved in this too. Academics and universities were basically talking about the dangers of Hindutva, Hinduism, and the same debate that we're having. So not to, again, put ourselves in a box and take positions, but these opinions really matter because these folks that we showed, and there were many more that we didn't, this was a 3-day conference. We heard academic after academic espouse pure hate against a minority religion, a global minority religion, a religion that is a micro minority in the United States and Canada. And these voices really matter, as Aryan said, because, already on university campuses, you have to check a box to be able to host any kind of an event. You're being put into labels whether you want them or not. And most of us have kids or older kids or will have kids. We need to be aware of what environment our kids are going into and what this really means as we play out. So I want to go from here into something that, Shawn, you were talking about as you talked about these labels, something that has really kind of led to this conversation. We have been battling labels, and many in our community say, well, this is an academic debate. Let's stay out of it. We're free to embrace. And yes, that's true and to some extent, and not true to some extent, because you see the impact of these influences. But now we start to see, how does this change our day-to-day experience of being a Hindu, right? So for Aryan, it could be having to fill out a box. But for others, the pure hate that came during Diwali this year, right? So, you can decide, I'm going to be a good Hindu. I'm going to disavow Hindutva, and I will just, I will disavow Hindu nationalism, whatever that means, and I'm just going to be a good Hindu. But then what are you going to do when you had an event like we had this year on Diwali? And I'll just talk about this for a minute because it did shake me up. I do a lot of the posts on CoHNA's X account. And so on Diwali day, after I had done a lot of my Diwali work, couple of hours before the puja, I was like, well, let me just go there. And I know a lot of people have been posting Diwali greetings. A lot of lawmakers have been posting. So like an advocacy organization, let me just, make sure I go ahead and thank these lawmakers, etc. So spent about an hour doing that. And I was shocked because almost every person whose response I went into to put my thank you note, as I would look at the replies, there was like hate-filled, venomous, bigoted replies flooding innocuous tweets that were in many cases had no mention of the word Hindu at all. It was like, happy festival of lights to all of those who celebrate. And that led to an outpouring of hate. And it wasn't like an isolated, this lawmaker drew it or that lawmaker drew it. We just saw it across the board, whether you were a senator in Texas, whether you were a congressman in California, whether you were a city councilor, assembly person, all the way to the president. It was just, right-wing, left-wing, Democrat, Republican, it didn't matter. So when you see that kind of a hate that pours out against a beautiful, joyous festival, which has a very universal message about the victory of good over evil, about the triumph of light over darkness, it kind of shook me up a little bit, even though I've been fighting this hate for a while, because it was truly ripping apart the band, ripping away the cover on the hate that had been lurking sort of beneath the surface. So over the past few years, people have become more and more emboldened to be openly bigoted. This is also something that has driven a lot of conversations in our community. But the question is, how do you negotiate these labels if you've decided to be not Hindutva and Hindu, but then Diwali comes under attack? Where do you really stop, right? Where will you stop to avoid triggering others? Because I know we can share this article that came out just a week ago, Jayabhai, if you can find it. I apologize, I didn't send it to you. But CNN finally wrote about the hate. This was sort of the first mainstream media article that came out about the hate that's been targeting Hindus. Of course, they could not bring themselves to use the H word. They called it Indian Americans. And of course, there is Indian American hate as well. But, when you see millions of comments about Kali and Ganesh and Durga Puja, I think that's definitely Hinduism more than India. So what do we do with that, right? How do we think about this? Because if you look at this article and we just scroll through it very quickly, what struck me, a lot in the community were happy that somebody was finally noticing the hate against us. I actually thought this article was even more problematic than if it had not been written, because it was basically an exercise in victim shaming. It didn't really commiserate with the victims. It just said, well, this happened, but didn't these folks sort of bring it on themselves, right? Because, they've been celebrating so openly, and they've not been standing up for this or that group, and they've been voting this way or another. Like, this is victim shaming and blaming at its finest. And to make things even worse, the reporter goes on to interview and get commentary from figures like Rakib Naik, as though he is a disinterested, dispassionate observer of this issue. These are people who are primarily, who have worked very hard over the last decade, I would say, to create the anti-India hate, to create the Hinduphobia and Hindu bigotry that is now coming out into the mainstream. And to have him quoted without any mention of the number of hit pieces this man has done on every Hindu organization that exists, on the fact that his whole institute is funded by a suspicion. It's just like bizarre. And I could only think about the articles that had come out a couple of years ago when the Leicester riots had happened in UK. So when the Leicester riots had happened in UK, New York Times, BBC, all of them, they had sort of platformed Majid Freeman and again provided quotes from him as though he was a dispassionate observer of the whole event. Turns out, of course, he was one of the prime people instigating the violence and has actually been arrested earlier this year. So I just thought this article was almost like rubbing salt in a wound. But I don't know if that's just me or what you guys think about that.
So there's so the article and then the feedback from the article actually is very interesting, because one thing that I noticed is that when the article was posted, as you mentioned, many people were sharing it widely because, and then you start trying to figure out, well, why? Because now you're seeing that there is some sort of validation from CNN that this is a problem. And this kind of speaks to a larger problem with our Hindu community, which needs addressing, is that you're so happy when CNN writes an article, but the deeper rot inside you don't understand. Because if you go into the article and you click the links to the report, you actually start seeing that in the report that CNN is quoting, they deny that anti-Indian hatred is anti-Hindu. And then I'm reading this thing and I am like, give me a break here, because let's just go by pure numbers. Right now, India is generally 80% Hindu. It's probably fluctuates 78%, 79%. When you are saying anti-Indian hate is not anti-Hindu hate, you are basically whitewashing everything, and you don't want to actually pinpoint what the problem is. So now we have Hindus themselves that are resharing this thing like, yes, we're getting recognition, but they themselves don't understand that the real source of the problem is not anti-Indian hatred. It's actually Hinduphobia. And if we don't address the root problem, this is never going to stop. And you brought up an interesting point, is that when you shared your post and when you saw the comments on Diwali, one of the things that I started wondering to myself is that, is this hatred new, or is it something that's just coming to the surface? And I think if I'm honest with myself, and I think if every Hindu is honest with themselves, they are coming to the realization that anti-Hindu hatred has always existed. It's under the surface because we live in a largely Judeo-Christian society. Like Western society is based on Judeo-Christian principles. And when you start seeing it from that lens, then you realize, wait a minute, a lot of this hatred was probably always there. Now we have a platform. And I think, honestly, is that it's better that it comes to the surface now, because now you know what you're dealing with, because it's probably easier to argue with someone that is constantly at your face than wondering what is beneath the surface of someone who is showing you, like the saying goes, lipstick on a pig, right? It's that is I think what the biggest problem is. So now that we know that this is the case, what are we going to do about it? So I think the first step is that these articles that come out, fine, it's getting publicity, but we also actually have to state that, wait a minute, anti-Indian hatred. I'm not going to deny that, yes, there are Indians that are not Hindu, but you also can't deny the fact that India is 80% Hindu, and a lot of that hatred is actually stemming from that fact.
John, would you say that a lot of the hatred online that you see is just a minority of the population, or would you say it's more widespread?
That I think is a fair question. So bots of course are a thing. The problem that I see though is when this hatred started, it was very on sites like 4chan and things like that. And then it starts percolating through and through and through. And then you start seeing videos where people are posting, sharing it. And these are people that are not on 4chan. So I think there's a case to be made that whatever little things have percolated into our society has now actually grown more and more and more. And you take, for instance, some of the things that have happened in Canada here, where we do have large murtis that are being established, and I mean that's a topic for another webinar. But at the same time, though, is that there are people that are overtly saying that tear it down, things like that. So I do think that online certainly does influence real world, and I do think that it is growing. In reality, personally, I have received many messages from people saying that they went into a store and then someone actually just said something, go back to your country, right? Like something along those lines. Like that never used to happen in the last 10, 15 years. Like we're talking about when my dad came to Canada in the 1970s, that overt sort of racism existed then. And then I think we were living in a period from the 90s, the early 2000s, where we kind of felt that the society was getting more global. But what do we see, lo and behold, in 2025? It's like history is repeating itself.
I also think in terms of things I've seen on the ground, I think a lot of times the anti-Hindu violence that I see is often framed on the ground as anti-Indian violence. And I think that's an issue I face. There's certain examples, for example, temple vandalisms, where it's very, very hard to deny. But then they'll always use the argument that, oh, it's anti-Indian government and it's not intended to be anti-Hindu. And you'll get into that debate. But I think broadly speaking, I think the anti-India argument is kind of it's used to argue that, oh, this is just, people not liking immigrants, for example, people not liking Indians broadly, whereas obviously, as you said, most Indians are Hindus. And I think these attacks are specifically targeted toward a specific religion. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I think we need to acknowledge that. We need to say it, because if we don't, and we go under the guise that the hatred is strictly H1B as to what's happening in U.S. politics right now, or in Canada here that is just like the surge in the population. There is a case to be made that a lot of it stems from people's inherent biases that they don't want to have to contend with. I faced it myself, and it's about time that we actually speak openly about it.
Yeah, I want to bring up this thing because it happens a lot, right? Is it anti-India hate? Is it anti-immigrant sentiment? Is it anti-Hindu? I think as a society, we are much more comfortable recognizing racism and then anti-immigrant hate, but there is a strong, strong desire to deny anti-Hindu hate. And it's interesting because the same society recognizes anti-Semitism, it recognizes Islamophobia, it recognizes hate against other religions. I mean, I'm not saying it's mainstream. I hope to God it never does become mainstream. But I think Hindus are the only ones who are repeatedly told by institutions and by academics that even talking about hate against them is Hindu nationalism or bigotry in itself. In the context of, Jebbai, I sent you a document. I don't know if it's possible to share it, but, certainly last year, December led to an explosion of hate against H-1Bs and anti-immigrant sentiment. But if you're able to show the document, I had actually pulled a few tweets that showed how clearly that you may be against H-1Bs or you may be against immigrants, but there was this famous or infamous post on X that said, well, if you're a high IQ engineer, and then I did give access, Jebbai, so if you can find it, that's great. If not, no worries. So it said that, if you're a high IQ engineer, but you worship, and then there was a picture of Kali, right? So again, if you're talking about H-1Bs, why is Kali relevant? Why is Ganeshji relevant? Why is any of our Hindu traditions relevant? Because H-1B does not have a special category for any religion, including Hinduism. Obviously, a lot of H-1Bs are Hindu, and I think that is, again, and just like the temple attacks, we are seeing where anti-India hate is used as an excuse. So if you just go to the first one, Jebbai, the very first X post, and if we can click onto it, it kind of, shows it. This is the tweet I was talking about, where basically, and this is literally a day or two after this whole event had started. So I think, again, hate is a fluid thing. It comes in many different ways. And certainly, I'm not saying that the people who hate Hindus love non-Hindu Indians, but there is definitely a strong component of Hinduphobia in the anti-India hate. And this guy, and these are not, this is December 27th. So this is like within a couple of days of this whole thing starting. And these are not online trolls or bots with 100 followers or 500 followers. These are major handles with upwards of 100K, 200K followers. We've seen people with followings of 1 million jump into this. So to me, this sort of encapsulates, right? You're a high IQ engineer from India and these are your gods. So I think it's very important for our community to keep that in mind. And I think that was because if you scroll down further, right, we soon saw this escalation go into the attacks on the murtis, the attacks, and then flat out attacks on temples, because this lady who is largest Hindu temple, basically a story on the Baptist temple in New Jersey. And she's basically like, immigration is a problem if it leads to this, right? And I think further on in her thread, somebody actually asked her that, so are you going to be okay with Indians that are Indian Christians? And she's like, yeah, I could think about that. That might be okay, but this temple stuff is definitely not okay. This was one of the Diwali tweets that had set off a major firestorm. So I just wanted to just bring it up. We can stop sharing, Jebbai. Just because it was very clear that we ourselves as a community, the press, the article that was written, they're very quick to use it as a label about anti-immigrant, anti-India, anti-whatever. And there may be pieces of all of that, but they're working very hard to deny the anti-Hindu aspect of it. And I think that's very important to call out, because if we are willing to live with hate against Diwali, Shawn, I want to tease this out a little bit more. If we are willing to accept hate against Diwali, then where are we really drawing the line as Hindus? And this is something where I want to hear both of you talk, right? Because where are you negotiating, or how do second generation Hindus from places other than India, negotiate this question on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that is a point where you start going down this rabbit hole. Is you had said something earlier that made me stop and think, is how do you be a good Hindu, right? And I think that is something that the average Hindu growing up in the US and Canada is probably thinking about in the context of all of these conversations and the hatred that exists. So how do I be a good Hindu on Diwali? So that means I will celebrate in my home. I might light one diya outside, and then that's it. So, we had a whole thing here about fireworks in Mississauga. So then the question becomes, and these are honest conversations that I've had here in my home. So we want to do fireworks this year, and then our friends from across the street, they heard we were doing fireworks as well, so then they come over, and then so this is where it becomes a process of negotiation of, okay, so I don't want to attract hatred to myself, so then I am going to pare back what I'm going to do. And this is what you see a lot of Hindus sort of saying, is that I have to compromise who I am to be able to fit in. And it does bring up an interesting question about assimilation, which is a whole other topic, but does sort of fit into this broader question that we ask ourselves as Hindus, is that what do I change to fit into the society? And at what point does this negotiation become this downward spiral where we start paring away what is it that makes us who we are? And I think when we look at it, the labels that are being applied to us force us into this corner where now you have to start saying that, well, I can't do this and I can't do that, and I should only do this because of all this exterior hate that exists. And I think for us growing up here, at some point you have to make a stand, and you just have to look at what is everyone else doing? What is everyone else saying? And what is everyone else allowed to do? And I think when I look at it, and if we take this past Diwali as an example here within my own neighborhood, I had my Bangladeshi Muslim neighbor from across the street come over because they also wanted to participate in fireworks outside. I had a lot of friends from my son's grade 2 class come, and they wanted to participate. And I think this is where we have to sort of kind of separate, the hatred exists, but also what is the ground reality too. And you look at this was true for myself, and you look at anyone that's in grade 2, like boys, girls, kids growing up, and you tell them that you're going to be lighting fireworks, everyone's excited about it. And I think, we need to understand that you can start trying to frame yourself as being a good Hindu, meaning that you should only do X, Y, and Z because of this is where you are. Or you can look at it in a different way, saying that these are our traditions. I'm going to explain it to you in a way that you understand, and we'll come up with a way that we can celebrate it properly. But we shouldn't have to whitewash who we are as a Hindu just because there's labels that are being applied to us. And I think Aryan had a very good point in that, why is it that any expression of wanting to do something Hindu in campus has to be prefaced with that I am not this? And it really baffles my mind, is that we have to state the negative in order to assert the positive, when in reality what we should be able to do is just say, hey, I'm Hindu, we light fireworks, or that's just one example, but you get my point, is that I am Hindu, this is what we do, and then have a discussion about that. But because of how Hinduism has been portrayed and the Hindu nationalist rhetoric that gets thrown on anyone, we are now facing two battles, is that we have to explain ourselves, but then we also have to deny something that actually has no meaning for us here too. And I had this conversation yesterday too, is that political Hinduism is a term that gets thrown around, and it was in the video that you showed earlier. What relevance does that have to us here in Canada and America? Like, that is a India problem. And you want to import that because now you want to silence our voices. And that's how I see it being used?
Just add, I think there is a certain sense of like oppression Olympics at play, because I think you can, of course, they're bringing it from India, but then at the same time, like first they can blame it on anti-India hate, but then the next bad, like, bogeyman is the Hindus. So maybe we're making progress, who knows? But I think at some point, and I actually agree with you, I think at some point you just have to do what you're doing. I think, every time when, my team at CYAN and Berkeley is thinking of like hosting an event, we're always considering how might this event be portrayed by XYZ group? Would they consider protesting this event? All right, if we're considering a controversial event, should we request security, which is something we had to do for a Kashmiri Pandit event, where we actually had to contact law enforcement for security. So this is not just like, like something that's happening online. We actually are negotiating these things as we're just trying to host an event, talking about, for example, the exodus that Kashmiri Pandits have gone through. But I think that has resulted in a lot of different interpretations of how to respond. I just personally have some takes that I think certainly differ from like my friends at Hinduphobia at Berkeley, for example. One of those being that, we want to, for example, have a conversation with, student government officials, also the Sikh community at Berkeley. But then the issue is, are we going to be painted as fascists, as Hindu nationalists? And at the same time, if we are painted as that, why would they want to work with us? And so in, engaging in these conversations, we've in a way almost, this is one form of, you could call it assimilation or adjusting, have been forced to de-link the idea of being Hindu from the idea of India and relegating it instead to the idea of spiritual homeland in broader Bharat. And if we're working with a Sikh group, for example, that supports Khalistan, I think there is another form of negotiation we have to go through, which is, we're open to working with you if you have qualms against the Indian government, because that doesn't have to do with me as a second generation Hindu. But if you're going to start vandalizing temples or you endorse vandalisms, that's where we draw the line. And so I think that has been a personal negotiation for us, of course, but I think in a way it's also caused a lot of strife within our community internally, because, for example, when someone like me says that I don't have any care for like the Khalistan issue beyond when it affects me, when I go to the temple, people are like, well, the Khalistani movement has done a lot of like, things, for example, the bombing of an airplane that was going to Canada. So the question is, as a North American student, should I be affected by that? And I think it's two parts. First, if it affects you in the North American context, of course you should be affected by it, especially if it's inherently anti-Hindu. But I think the second part is that at the end of the day, the idea of Khalistan, and I know I'm talking about this specifically, but the broader idea, there is a broader idea in that these issues aren't necessarily something that affects second generation Hindus enough for us to take a position on it. So when I talk to, and I was just having a conversation with another Hindu student at Berkeley last night who wants to be involved in CYAN, but he doesn't support Hindutva. In fact, he's quite opposed to it, yet he's still pro-Hindu. And I've met so many students like this. I fear that when we take positions that are might align with India's interests, even though we are not necessarily aligned with a government's interests, we're pushing away a lot of the students that might otherwise be supportive of our organizations. And so that's why I have personally, whenever I talk about Hindu advocacy, quite honestly, always said that we've never supported Hindutva. We've also never opposed Hindutva because, frankly, we don't think there should be a prerequisite for it. At the same time, we are a Hindu American group. We are not an Indian group. So that means representing all Hindus, not just those from India. Also means representing Hindu positions, not necessarily ones that another country endorses. And that's naturally caused me some backlash, but I think it's a necessary shift for our movement that needs to happen in the coming years, because otherwise the dual loyalty slurs they're going to keep hitting. And at some point we have to acknowledge the fact that we have to openly acknowledge the fact that they don't exist.
You actually raise a very interesting point that actually mirrors a lot of the sentiment from Hindus from the Caribbean as well, because having been so dissociated from Bharat, so the idea of a political India versus the idea of Hindu being the spiritual homeland for Hindus for a lot of people from the Caribbean, those are two separate things. Those are two separate things. And one of the things that I think many people struggle with, and this is only going to become more apparent as generations grow up now in America, is that there is not going to be a connection to political India. We are in a transition phase where we have our parents and or grandparents that actually came, so they do have those actual physical ties to the country. But now when you start coming in, and now where generations are going to be born here, those physical ties to the country are now gone. And I think that negotiation that you'd bring up is a constant sort of conversation that I'm having internally as well. How much do I say about what's happening politically in India versus how much do I actually talk about Hinduism in a broader scale? And I think where I struggle with, and I'm going to be honest with everyone here, is that I do find it sometimes hard to talk about Hinduism in generally without talking about the political situation too in India. And I've had many people reach out to me saying you should talk about this thing that's going on in India. You should talk about that thing. And I think where that tension is that if the political situation in India is not good, those physical sacred sites that we hear about in our scriptures, what's going to happen to them? And so I think we need to continue sort of thinking about this as well. And it will be interesting to see where this lands, because what you said is, can we have an idea of Sanatan Dharma where we view India as this spiritual homeland without constantly getting labeled with the terms that is being used in India? Because when those terms are being used, there will be people here that will openly identify as, I am pro-Hindu, but don't bring in all of this politics stuff. And I think that's where the negotiation is. It's a very interesting dynamic. I've witnessed it myself. I live it myself as well, trying to always navigate that. I think it becomes even more apparent now because certainly in Canada, the increased immigration has brought me in touch with people my own age, people younger with me that newly immigrated to here, and I'm getting to hear their stories as well. So where do you think that is going to land? Do you feel that there will be a complete dissociation with India as a nation state, or do you think that there we'll eventually find ourselves in a balance where we can have both?
So I have
it's also going to be like, I don't think you're going to like everything. You're not going to arrive at one answer because people are going to negotiate. But there's one thing I want to say, like, you both are obviously deep in this space and have put a lot, you're out there fighting, you put a lot of action. I hear from people who just, they're like, my kid doesn't care. But the hate against this stuff is making the child disassociate from traditions that they would otherwise embrace. And to me, that is also a problem because, we were talking about labels and why Hinduphobia is denied. But if you look at like anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, it's brought up when, like the expectation is that a Muslim American teenager has no reason to be tracking, agreeing or denouncing stuff that, countries that they may come from, where their roots lie, are doing, right? So there is the whole concept of Islamophobia is like, you as an individual living in the US or Canada do not have to constantly be tracking what's happening in the 52 countries across the world and explaining or apologizing for it. And that's to expect otherwise is Islamophobia. But Hindus are expected to sort of be tracking. Go ahead, Aryan.
Yeah, I just really wanted to add, I think, because I've had these conversations in depth with like students at my Jain Students Association, as well as of course the Hindu Students Association. And I think the issue we face in kind of where we draw the line is that a lot of these issues, and I'll concede this, a lot of these issues, like for example, Khalistan, like you said, Shawn, do affect like temples on the ground. Like, yes, we're just talking about ideas, but at the end of the day, if, for example, you had something like a Khalistan, these affect our sacred sites in that region. And so I think it's a totally valid point, and I don't really have a substantive response to it. I think I think at some point we have to, within the movement, you kind of have to pick and choose which ones are more important to you and which ones you're willing to let go. And I think that is controversial. So
I also wanted to go back to another thread that we were having, and we'll look at some of the questions as well, because I think there's a lot of questions about what to do, etc. And I just want to again show people some of the resources that already exist, because there were a lot of questions on how do we fight back, etc. Right? You talked about how you had seen hate migrate from 4chan into more mainstream places. And I want to point everybody to a report that was published in August of 2022 by a group at Rutgers called the Network Contagion Research Institute. And it's it was very groundbreaking when it was published in 2022. Now that we're in 2025, I would actually say it's pretty prophetic, because a lot of the stuff they talked about then as something that they had observed in the online space only. They basically talked about this explosion of online anti-Hindu hate as well as Hinduphobia. And they were surprised at the level, and they were also surprised at how less it is discussed. But when I read this report in August 2022, it was the first time I had heard about the word Pajit. And at that time, it was only something being found in obscure 4chan places. But now, unfortunately, we see it all over the place in all kinds of platforms. I've even seen it in videos as a street slur. So I think they were very prophetic in terms of the hate online starting to impact real life. And I bring this up because there are many in our community. So I would encourage them to read it. It also talks about the other thread that you brought up at the beginning of the conversation about, is this hate that we are seeing something new? And this report actually goes on to say that this hate might be old wine in a new bottle, right? So it kind of ebbs and flows. And, many of us came to the United States and Canada at a time when it was at a lower end, and maybe now it's going back up high. So I think it's very important for the community to be aware of this, to use it, to share it, because this report did warn that online hate can lead to real life hate and real life violence. And I think we have all seen that happen in the last couple of years. So let's look at a couple of questions, and let's also talk about what is it that you can do to basically push back, create a space for yourself. What are some of the things that, Aryan, you're doing that can offer a path out to people? Because everyone's obviously not probably going to be able to get to the level that you are at. So what are some of the easy things?
I think it's twofold. So one is from the students, one is from the parents. First is, I think students naturally, of course, demographically speaking, will start to get more involved in the humanities and political science scene. It'll happen, but I think we already have so many students that would otherwise have majored in these subjects, but don't because of parental pressure and things of that sort. So what I would tell the parents actually is to encourage your students to get involved in this. It's not a lot of times my parents will be at a CoHNA event and another person will tell them hey, your kids are doing so great, and I wish my kids did that, etc. But oftentimes either the kids don't even show up at these events, or their kids are not majoring in these things, but we are, right? So I think it really has to do with taking initiative and also being open to pursuing other majors and your passions, because I can guarantee you that a lot of the Hindu students I meet on campus that are computer science majors love history. They love things like that. They would love to practice law, but there's that stigma, unfortunately, associated with the profession.
Interesting. I think that's a note to all the parents on our call is, I know as a community, we have a fascination for STEM, but a lot of, every STEM CEO still has to follow the policy set by the HR director. So don't cede that space.
Just to piggyback on what he has said, if there's any younger parents watching this that have younger kids, these conversations should probably start happening at home. So when they do enter into high school and academic institutions in whether it be colleges, universities, and they're having to confront Hindu nationalism and Hindutva, at least there's some base level understanding of what it is. There are some interesting questions that actually came in. I would like to probably address one of them. So this one came in quite early on. This is from Ravi. He said, if merely practicing Hinduism is also labeled as Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, should the focus be on understanding the negative annotations and unhesitantly owning such terms, or should we focus our energy on disconnecting from such terms? So I think I agree with what Aryan said, because this has been my position from it too. We should not have to associate or dissociate from it, is that it should not be applied to us in the first place. That, I think, is what the fundamental problem here is that for a Hindu born in Canada, for myself, whose parents came from the Caribbean, these labels don't apply to us. But the unfortunate thing is that we're living in a situation now where the labels are being forced on us, and then we're being forced to give an answer. That, I think, is what the fundamental problem is here. And then there's a later one on asking what our definitions are of Hindutva, and maybe, let me just read it here, is that it seems, this is from Charu, it seems that the meaning of Hindutva has been manipulated and now the distorted meaning has taken hold, leading to the reluctance of people wanting to in any way associate with Hindutva. Hindutva is simply the essence of being Hindu. Does this panel define Hindutva differently? So yes, I agree that the meaning of Hindutva certainly is the essence of Hinduism. Fine. The problem that I have too is that it has come to mean something in India as a political movement, political Hinduism. My question though is that, does this apply to Hindus here? And I think that is where we need to have a serious debate about it. If the definition was simply the essence of Hinduism, sure, like that's what we are. The problem is when we try to import these definitions to a different society that we have grown up with, founded in different principles of how the society functions. This is where now we're having to navigate what all these terms mean. And I think that is the problem that we have. If Aryan wants to have a Hindu Heritage Month, wants to have a Ganesh Puja or something like that, that should be a no-brainer. The problem is that we have imported these terms, not through ourselves though, because people have applied it to us. And the argument that I think I'm trying to make is that this should have never even been something that we have to contend with. That is essentially what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I would also just say that, again, not arguing for one label or another. It's really important to fight for one space, because you concede one label, the next one will be made problematic. Because if it's just a fight for one term, then this is the other community is always telling us, forget it, it's a word, move on. And you can move on, and we do move on. And I think, as a community, we've been quite willing to be flexible, to adjust. But that was my point about that, when the hate explodes against something as fundamental and basic as Diwali, then really what's left to negotiate, right? So sometimes I feel that the ask is to negotiate ourselves out of existence, because our very existence seems to be a provocation, which is about the only thing that seems to, that the very sight of a murti is triggering to some people. And I'm not sure you can really negotiate with them, right? Unless I'm basically going to give up fundamental aspects of who I am, which is again, I'm not saying everybody should do that, but that's not what I'm going to do. And so I think everyone has to negotiate those labels and spaces, but I think we should negotiate it as part of the broader context. And the video that I showed earlier was precisely for that, because we've seen that sometimes compromise is not possible with somebody who really just feels you have no right to exist. I really don't see how, you can negotiate. We can wrap up the fireworks by 10. We can do this. All of those are good things to think about, go for lower and whatever, those are compromises. But if somebody just says don't do murti puja or don't do something, well, I'm sorry, I'm not asking you to do murti puja, but if it's important to me, I will do it. And if I'm going to build a temple on private land with my money, if that bothers you, that's on you, not on me, right? So I think that's why it's hard to give these black and white answers. But I think The answer is really, the reason CoHNA was created was exactly so that we have a space, a platform where we can just discuss things and negotiate and do things as Hindus without all this, because we all have multiple identities. But in this space, for this movement, the Hindu identity is where, is paramount, and where we bring our worldview in. I just want to make a shout out for where we were talking about how to negotiate as a young person. And before the young person, right, parents. So we're an immigrant heavy community. And by the time a lot of immigrant parents realize the problem, it's already a bit late because their kids are in high school or in college. So I do want to make a shout out for Hindu Parents Network, a very important platform. If you're a parent, young parent, if you're planning to become a parent, you're thinking about getting married, it's really important because it tells you, it kind of shows you the world that your child is in, which is not the world that you have been in, right? You probably came to the US or Canada as an adult. When you come in your 20s, your sense of identity is already formed largely. And, I faced racism, and I fought back and I was annoyed at the person, but it didn't threaten my sense of worth. Had I faced the same situation when I was 12 or 13, it might have impacted me differently. And so I think Hindu Parents Network kind of educates young parents as to what is happening or is likely to happen in their child's school, and then give you some tools to how to talk to your child about it, how to, I like to say, inoculate your child, because, as good parents, you all give vaccinations to your kids, you take them to preventive care checkups, but this is equally important. We know some things are going to happen, like in 7th grade, they're going to get a session in world history, which will talk about Hinduism as nothing more than, caste, cows, and conflict. That's going to happen. You can't change it. So what you can do is, in the years before, the 5-6 years before they get to 6th or 7th grade, you have educated yourself, you have given your child the education and the tools to think about it so that they can A, not get impacted by those lessons, and B, maybe they can even talk to their friends about it. So cannot say enough about this platform as a way to understand and educate and connect with other parents as well. And then, of course, the work that, resources like Shawn's YouTube channel, I think if you're looking for a video to talk about some of these issues we've been talking about, or even something simpler, how to do a puja, right? How do I think about Kali Ma? How, some things that you may struggle as an immigrant parent to explain to your American or Canadian born child. I cannot recommend Shawn's channel more highly than I do already. I think it's a great resource. And then CYAN, place for Hindus to come together and talk. So I think ultimately it is a lot of educating and taking action in ways that work for you in your particular situation. Sorry, long plug, but had to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I want to also give a shout out for all the work that is being done by the Hindu Parent Network. I share it with everyone that I know. There's many parents that I've shared it with that said that they did not know something like that existed. I said, yes, they don't. I said they are working in the background to empower parents so that children, have resources to actually go to, which is very important. There's a lot of questions here, a lot of great questions here, and I think one of the last ones here is about the use of labels, and can labels change in the time that it's in. And I have no argument with that. Is that and I know this is not a discussion on Hindutva, but that seems to be the one that a lot of people brings up a lot of strong reactions from the Hindu side, being pro Hindu, but also from the anti-Hindu side too, of those that want to go against it. And my own position on the word is that the word itself has been used in multiple different ways. There was a time in history where it was used to fight against the British colonial powers. And then it has morphed into how a lot of people understand it today, that they understand it as just being the essence of what the Indian culture is. The problem that we have is that the baggage that it also brings to us, to just your average day Hindu here in North America. And I just want to say to everyone commenting on it, not enough has been done to explain that to people here, which is why these labels get applied. And I can say this from my own, like I started making videos in 2017 and people started applying this thing and I'm like, I don't even know what this is. And like I'm in my 30s, I'm like, okay, so then I started looking it up and then it's like, oh, now this is a political movement and then now it has morphed into this and then you just find yourself in this situation where it's like, dude, I just want to do puja in my house. Like I just want to go and pray. Like, but now you're being forced fed into these things and like this is the problem that we have is that yes, labels change. I totally agree with that. But can we honestly say that it's changed to the point where everyone is openly embracing it? I don't think so. Because if it was, we wouldn't have the Dismantling Hindutva conference, right? But here we see where labels and when you see stuff like that, you have to push back against it. And I think where I am right now, and I'm not saying that my views will stay the same, is that I still question, do these labels mean anything to Aryan in his work that he's doing there? Because you have Hindus that are going to be like, yeah, I don't want to have anything to do with that because of what the connotations are, which I think is very fair. And we shouldn't try to just force feed students to say that they have to accept it because this is what it is. Because then you are not having a conversation and you're not meeting those students where they are, which I think is a bigger problem that we have within our Hindu society, is that you don't meet students that have grown up and are part of a culture of American culture, of North American culture. You're not meeting them where they are, and you want to force feed them into something that you think that they have to accept. And then that just goes against the entire essence of what it means to be Hindu, is this constant conversation back and forth of debating, of trying to get to the truth. That I think is where we need to go. And in just reading the comments, I just want everyone to understand that this is where we are right now. You have to accept that we are in North America, we are in Canada, and this negotiation, if you're not willing to have it, then you need to accept what the results of that is going to be. If you're telling that every Hindu student needs to accept Hindutva, what is that going to mean to the thousands of Hindus that have no meaning of what that word is, but only understand it from one point of view? So we need to have the conversations and don't just say that you have to accept it. That's my little rant.
No, it was great. Because I couldn't agree more. I think on campus, we have framed our Hindu movement as inherently progressive. And I hope this answers some of the questions, because I see like, how are you discussing this on college campuses and so that it won't bite you in your pursuits? I think the idea of like an event series we've done, indigeneity has an expiration date, is inherently decolonial. It's not really a right-wing like talking point. It's like that oftentimes we get painted as, it's actually a fairly left-wing talking point. And so I think in that sense, we have painted ourselves as we are a very progressive movement, especially on a campus at UC Berkeley. And I'll just add to what Shawn is saying. I think a lot of the students we get in CYAN inherently understand that they, have varying perspectives on the issue and nonetheless are willing to work with each other. The only students that, might not necessarily want to be involved in that are students that are, for example, opposed and at the same time reject any form of conversation or discussion with the other side. And so I really do want to emphasize that there are plenty of pro-Hindu students that I've met at Berkeley that are very pro-Hindu, believe me, that don't support like things like Hindutva, and I don't fault them for it. I think we need a wide coalition, and that's how coalitions are built. You can't just exclude some people because they don't, necessarily support an ideology.
Also, I think, it's not about, like I said, it's not about fighting for labels, but it's making sure that they get that their disdain for one word or another does not lead them to dissociate from Hinduism in general. I see that as the bigger problem, right? So and I think we've never been a faith of, all outs, right? So it's a question of negotiating your space. But the important thing is, and I think that's some of the questions that I want to look at, is aside from engaging from these topics, what are the impact you're seeing, right? How do we stop it from impacting like more practiced aspects. And I keep coming back to Diwali and Holi because these are, as part of our negotiation process, a lot of Hindus have already become like what you can say almost very cultural Hindus, right? And so a large part of their Hinduism is expressed through festivals. And festivals are really critical because that's one of the few times in our lives in the US and Canada that we become more visibly Hindu, right? So we live happily in our suburban neighborhoods, but suddenly we'll have lights go up in October, right? And everyone's like, okay, what's going on? It's a little early for Christmas, or you're taking the day off for Diwali, or you might, now as the scale of the community has increased, the big garbas and the big pujas. So if people are, how do we make sure that everybody doesn't want to get into this debate of Hindutva versus Hinduism, but how can we protect these very fundamental aspects of lived Hinduism, right? Because my fear is it doesn't stop at one label or another, and we've seen that. The people on campuses, the professors have already targeted Diwali and Holi as problematic just for, because Holi is apparently an upper caste celebration of a Bahujan woman's burning, and Diwali is praying to casteist oppressive gods. So how do we empower Hindus, not necessarily to embrace labels that they don't like, but to make sure that any baggage associated with labels does not bleed over into other more fundamental aspects of Hinduism?
That, man, if I had the answer for that, that would probably solve a lot of problems. Because, so I think honestly, groups like CoHNA certainly help, because you are putting a voice to some of the issues that many of us have. How do you protect the traditions and ensure that it continues down? I think I need to think about that. That's a very interesting question. In my own experience, there many people have even in the West Indian community, when I do speak up, like I get labeled as so many different things: pro Modi, Hindu nationalist, and all of these things. And I think on a surface level, at some point, I just look at it and I accept it and I move on. But then that's me. I think the harder question is those individuals that just want to just do what they're doing. So just live a simple life. And I think at some point you have to place the tradition at the forefront of it. And you have to just look at it. What is it that I want to preserve? And regardless of the labels that people are applying on it, you find value in that tradition. And I think these are questions that everyone personally has to grapple with. We have spoken a lot about the cultural Hindu here. And I think, like all of these individuals exist on a spectrum, is that you have those that are certainly that would want people to be quote unquote more religious, and then you have those that are in the middle that maybe just attend one or two things, and then you have those on the opposite end that don't want to have anything to do with anything sort of like Hindu practice, but still identify as a Hindu. I think what needs to happen is that everyone needs to look at themselves in the mirror and just ask themselves a question: is that, am I concerned enough to ensure that Hinduism survives for the next generation? And I think once you answer that question for yourself, you'll probably find the answers. The problem that I have and why I struggle to answer your question is that I don't know if we'll ever get out of these labels, because the framework that we live in, these labels are automatically applied. That's just what we have grown up in. And I think that's the part that I think, from a systemic level is going to be very, very hard. But I think individually, everyone has a responsibility to sort of look at themselves in the mirror and say, why is it that I want this tradition to continue? And what am I going to do to make sure that happens? And I think that's a personal question for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point about why do we want this tradition to continue. And I think that is, again, where your channels and, the Hindu Parent Network and, even CoHNA, this is one of the issues we ask people to think about, because, what happens if Hinduism goes away, right? What do we lose? From my perspective, I can just, my perspective is different from others' perspective, but I think that's a valuable thinking exercise, because I think even the Hindus who are do not like to call themselves Hindus. There's a growing desire to call yourselves spiritual, etc., etc. We do know there's a lot of value that our faith has provided, and that comes up with that whole other discussion, which we're not going to go into today, which is the whole appropriating information and knowledge of Hinduism. But going back to that old parable of, the golden goose giving the goose that gave the golden eggs, I think we all have a responsibility to realize that if we are just going to keep harvesting the eggs, but we don't do anything to keep the golden goose alive, or we want to kill the goose to get the eggs, the golden eggs are going to stop, right? So, I mean, and whether it's dance, whether it's medicine, whether it's yoga, whether it's, learning, I mean, whatever, there's such a font of knowledge in the scriptures, in the traditions, that give comfort in the modern life, whether, mental health is a huge problem these days. So I think even for those who are not particularly wedded to the tradition, that's one way to think about it, is do you really want to do your bit to demolish a ancient river of knowledge that has been flowing for several thousands of years? What will you lose? And what can I do to keep that river flowing? I kind of think of it in an environmental way. The earth is not mine. I'm a steward for the purpose of my lifetime, and I need to leave it in at least as good or a better shape than I inherited it from my parents. But Aryan,
I'm more optimistic than both of you. I think it's
good.
It's probably, I think it's rough, but I think we're doing better, and I actually think a lot of the people in academia are getting so desperate that they have to, for example, now start painting they need a mechanism to start painting second generation and third generation, fourth generation Hindu American students, the same way they paint first generation Hindu Americans. And that's why you have things like what was hosted at Rutgers with Audrey Shushki, right? They have to connect these Hindu student groups that are just like average Hindu student groups to like some broader political conspiracy about Hindus. So I think they're actually getting desperate. I actually think, as the demographics change, as more Hindus become US citizens, because right now it's around 55%, as those numbers change, I actually think our movement's just getting started. So maybe I'm overly optimistic, but we'll see.
Oh,
that's the best way to be. That's the best way to be. Overly optimistic. That is how you should always live your life. Because if you go to the other way, you would just sort of go down this negative rabbit hole and you just don't want to do it. Yeah.
And there are so many resources. I think a lot of questions here. Do we have a PR problem? Yeah, probably. What can we do about it? Well, I think CoHNA was one of the platforms created just to do something about it. And knowledge is really like, I'm always discovering new things, right? So we spent a lot of time discussing the Indian American identity or the Indo-Canadian identity versus the Hindu identity. I just found out from the last Carnegie survey that and I wrote an article about it, that only 55% of Indian Americans identify as Hindu. To me, that's like, my God, thank God we created CoHNA like 5 years ago, because you really cannot expect an Indian American organization to fight for Hinduism, given that, just about half of us are even identifying as Hindus. So I think it's really important to have Hindu organizations, Hindu spaces, and to be sort of, my view is be unapologetic, but at least be however unapologetic as you feel it appropriate to be. I mean, that's really important. There's honestly a font of resources, right? So I don't know if Jebai can show us the Hinduphobia page, but people were asking, like, where do I find information? We've made a conscious effort to put information from different sources, like academic sources, if you're in an academic setting, popular culture references. This is like the history of the word, but if you scroll down, I mean, this is a bit of a link farm, but it was deliberately set up that way. If you want to find out what's happening with the temple attacks in Canada, in US, it's right there. The NCRI report that I referenced is right there. Our counter to Audrey Trushki's, reports are like right there. Lots of professors writing about this issue, because again, the impression given is that it's a one-sided thing, and academics love to talk about stuff, but there's generally another academic who's also opposing them. It's where does the louder voices, right? And then advocacy, right? Let's look at the public policy actions that have resulted just in the last few years based on a very small set of groups talking. So Georgia actually recognized Hinduphobia at the state level. Cities in California recognized it, and Georgia hopefully next year will actually pass a bill that recognizes Hinduphobia, hugely important. Canada, we had 2 cities that recognized Hinduphobia, like really important. Wainwright in Alberta, Mississauga, major city in Toronto. So, I mean, these are like really, because the first point of like tackling this problem is to like give it a name. Unless it has a name, nobody's going to like talk about it. So when the guy got attacked in Taco Bell 3 years ago, the police struggled to understand what he was talking about because they had no name. They're like, well, is this racism? No, the guy attacking him is of the same race. So it's just that name is so important, and advocacy, I think, is so important, and education, the work that everyone's doing is really important. I mean, and I'm really heartened to hear, Aryan. I think we have really kind of gone over, but also, do you guys have any closing thoughts? Because I know we want to probably wrap up in like a few minutes. So just kind of closing thoughts. We've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot more ground that we need to cover, but some issue that I didn't touch upon that you really want to bring out. Let's use the last 10 minutes for that.
The only thing that I would like to add is that one of the things that we have to be wary of is when we use labels, whether it's inadvertent or labels are applied to us, we do go down this path of some people may not choose to associate with those labels, and it becomes important for us to understand why. And also realize that we need to ensure that there are more Hindus that are accepting of their identity. And that identity can encompass a lot of different ways that it expresses itself. So not to shut down conversations, that is probably the worst thing that we can do right now, but to maintain dialogue with those that may not agree necessarily with what your view is. At the end of the day, what it's going to come down to is that you want to ensure that the next generation, whether you have kids or not, or whether you have nieces, nephews, or anything like that, whether that next generation is willing to pick up the baton from where it's being left off. That ultimately is what matters the most. So don't shut down conversations. The labels are here. We have to learn to work through them, to work above them, and just move forward in that respect.
Yeah, I would just add, I think whatever solution does happen and whatever conversations do take place, especially from like the North American perspective, I hope there is a certain sense of like understanding for the struggle that we're facing. I remember, like, for example, I posted and like, I think all of us kind of acknowledge the issue that exists for like the Hindu population, but I think what a lot of us worry about is what the solution is. And so a lot of times when we've, from a Hindu American perspective, at least when we try to propose solutions, I think they can sometimes not necessarily be the most popular, but I still think that they are worth having a conversation and discussing, especially given the fact that, I talked to a lot of Hindu students at Berkeley, like a lot. I've spoken to students that have gone through actual Hinduphobic incidents from their professors who have told them that they were responsible for Belgaum, and I've helped them file reports, to just an average Hindu student who saw something about, for example, Bangladesh or Kashmir, and they're Hindu and they feel like they don't feel represented. So I speak to a lot of people, and these are the people that you might think are cultural Hindus. And they might not be as affirmative in their culture, in the sense that they might not, quote unquote, practice Hinduism, but when things happen, they go out of their way to make themselves available and support the community. And that's kind of how we, at CYAN, for example, got 50 plus people together for a vigil at Berkeley within 3 to 4 hours, on the same day as the Belgaum terror attack. So I think the cultural issue is there, but I think the solution will come from within those very same people. I don't know what that looks like, and that might not even be, we as Hindus that are probably more involved in the advocacy space probably don't even understand what that looks like, because we live in this sort of bubble. So when the last thing I'll just say is, when I think of solutions, like I know Vishal read this article and everything, I think when I think of solutions, I look to those students that are still speaking up about these Hindu issues, despite being the most cultural form of Hinduism that I can think of. My guess is the solution lies somewhere in there, and I'm still searching. So
I think when somebody brought up a question, actually it's a comment. I think it's very important to highlight from Dinesh Sharma. Hindus must know their rights and report the hate crimes to police and administrators. Do not stay silent. I cannot stress this enough, because we do a very poor job of reporting. And by reporting, I don't mean putting it in WhatsApp or posting it on your social media account. I mean, do that by all means, but do realize that's not a report. Even a media coverage is not report. The only thing that goes as discoverable evidence that gets into trackers is if you call, whether in your college, if you call campus security and go through that procedure. In California and many other states, there are hate hotlines that you can call your police. Unless you document it, I'm sorry, it did not happen. And it's kind of bizarre, but that's the way the world is, right? So I always tell people, you could be having a 6-month-long email chain with your school principal, and they can turn around and say, we have no complaint of anti-Hindu hate in our school, because your 6-month-long chain with the email, with the principal and 5 teachers is not discoverable. It's not a formal complaint. So if something is happening, make sure that you file the actual complaint form in your school district. They're all there. If you can't find it, reach out to us. We can generally help you find them. But yeah, you will have to put your name to it. Hotlines, you can probably call in anonymously, but please, please, please do that. That is really important. And when Hindus started doing it, we found in California, the first year that they reported data from the hate hotline in 2024, it was actually shocking to know that anti-Hindu hate reported in that hotline was second only to anti-Semitism, ahead of Islamophobia and everything else, right? So if we don't speak up, the problem's never going to be counted. So thank you, Dinesh ji, for bringing that up. Aryan, I think you're answering the question about the Berkeley Festival. Any last thoughts? I think we've had a good conversation. We'll just close it out there with the shout out to everybody. Thank you for joining us and staying with us for a fairly long conversation. We shared a lot of resources today. Please bookmark them, save them, share them, and use them. And I mean, at the end of the day, I can say there's nothing like connecting with other like-minded folks, whether it's at CoHNA, HPN, CYAN, Hindu Lifestyle, or any organization that you are part of. But really, this is a fight that we have to fight institutionally, because we are up against institutional voices. And that's why I keep going back to that video I showed at the beginning, because these were not the rants of somebody on the street, right? Somebody on the street rants, you can rant back and, fine, you're a big, powerful person, but you are up against institutional pushbacks. We as Hindus need to strengthen our own groups and institutions to push back. That's how the PR problem can be tackled. That's how Aryan can get enabled to go, fight for Hindu Heritage Month and UC Berkeley. That's, the platform that Shawn has built is something that we can all leverage, and we should leverage and share widely, so that every one of us doesn't have to spend time answering how to do puja. We can actually go and teach 5 people how to do puja, right? Versus having 20 videos about how to do puja. I just bring that up as an example. So big shout out to that. Join CoHNA, follow us on our social media handles, follow Shawn's YouTube channel, CYAN Berkeley, CYAN Instagram. Great way to get kids into the Hindu world is to get them to follow some Instagram handles. And there are a lot of them. That way they start that process of discovery on their own. So with that, I think we will call it a day. Thank you, everybody. The conversation shall continue, and please stay engaged with us. Namaste.